Hi everybody and welcome back to my channel. My name is Lucy and I'm a PhD student at the University of Birmingham, and on this channel we talk about all things PhD with a smattering of queer and a smattering of travel stuff. And today I want to talk to you all about how to structure your PhD thesis. Let's go with the video. So this video has been inspired by conversations I've been having recently with my friend Neela, who has appeared on this channel before. I'll link the video she was in above, and basically we did a tour of her master's UOB, University of Birmingham, accommodation. And in January, Neela started her PhD and we've been having conversations about structuring PhDs, about supervisor sessions, how you create chapters. What do you do chapters for? How do you focus on? And this got me thinking, and it made me realise that a lot of people when they start a PhD, they really feel kind of lost and just thrust into this like new world of research where everything kind of has to be determined by yourself, and it can be really overwhelming and really kind of scary in a way to just be like, and research. So I thought one thing that would help you is I'm going to talk you through how I came to kind of determine my thesis structure, what chapters I chose, kind of the process and the timeline for that. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, the first thing we should probably talk about is the timeline. I would say you don't really have to kind of firm up how you want to structure your thesis until roughly 6 months in. Now, I started my PhD in September and in June I had my mid-year review. And by the mid-year review, you do often have to submit a plan of your thesis, including like chapter summaries, kind of a rough overview, an abstract, I suppose you could say, of your thesis, what each chapter is roughly going to be about, and kind of the core themes of your PhD. So that gives you an idea of the timeline. There's about, September to June is about 9 months, but you have to submit your mid-year review before that, usually in, I think it was April, May time. So let's say within the first 6 months, you're going to start thinking about how you're going to structure your PhD, what chapters you're going to do, and that will obviously drive the focus of your research. And obviously once you've kind of decided your chapters, you are potentially already thinking about what your main topics are going to be, your main research questions, how everything's going to interconnect. Now, the caveat I would like to put on this is just because you have submitted that for the mid-year review does not mean those are set in stone. And they are certainly still going to change and evolve and adapt throughout the whole course of your PhD. And I don't just mean what you talk about in those chapters could change, but in another year's time, you could realise, that thing I've been researching for 6 months actually isn't as super relevant as I thought, so maybe this chapter needs to be changed completely, or maybe these two chapters are going to merge together. To give you an example of that, when I submitted my mid-year review, I said I was going to have 5 chapters. I said I was going to have a history one, which was kind of history and data, looking at the history of LGBT plus romance novels, how they've evolved, how they've grown, what's the state of them today. I was going to have one on the queer body, which is obviously looking at how is the body presented in queer romance novels. I was going to have one on the concept of family and found family and how does that transfer from heterosexual to queer romances. And then I was going to have one on the happy ever after, queer relationships, do the relationships change in queer romances? And then my final one was going to be looking at heteronormativity versus homonormativity. And that one was basically just going to be looking at like, are these heteronormative? Are they homonormative? Are they challenging heteronormativity? Are they just replicating it? Are they doing a whole new thing in these LGBT plus or queer romance novels? And probably about 4 months after my mid-year review, which went very well, all super positive, I realised that the last chapter, heteronormativity and homonormativity, was probably going to be a theme throughout the thesis. And it didn't make sense for it to have a separate chapter because it was something I was probably going to come back to again and again and again throughout the other chapters. And it would potentially just be a lot of repetition. It would be a lot of not really new stuff. And actually, it's probably something I'm going to pull together in a conclusion anyway. So I decided to scrap my final chapter. The other reason for that is 5 chapters, even though the first one, the history one, was going to be significantly shorter, is quite a lot in an 80,000 word dissertation. So that shows you how even at the mid-year review, which is when you kind of first put your more concrete ideas, you're still going to change it, you're still going to adapt it, but that would give you a rough timeline of when you need to start really firming up how you're going to structure your thesis. So that brings me quite nicely onto the structure. So I've talked about the timeline and I've given you examples of how I structured mine, but how do you actually go about structuring a PhD thesis? Now, the first thing I would say is look at how many words you have. At the University of Birmingham, for humanities, English literature, PhD, they expect you to produce something at around 80,000 words. Now, you can apply for extensions, like word extensions, which I think can get you up to 100,000, but most people, it's like 80,000. And that sounds like a huge amount when you first start out. But in reality, that goes pretty quick, because if you've got, let's say, 4 chapters, and you need an introduction and a conclusion, you're really looking at about 15,000 words per chapter at that point, which isn't as scary because you've already probably done something very similar length for your master's dissertation. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you have to have 4 chapters. It doesn't mean they all have to be the same. But what I would say from talking to other people is most people that I've spoken to who are doing PhDs in the English literature department have between 3 or 4 chapters. 5, like I said, I had at a push, but usually then you acknowledge that one of them is going to be shorter from the get-go. So you're going into this thinking, okay, I'm going to have an introduction, I'm going to have between 3 and 4 chapters, and I'm going to have a conclusion. And then depending on your project, there are a couple of different ways you can then obviously structure it. And what I would say is play around with it. I think when I was coming up with my structure, I had about 5 different options. I thought, okay, do I do this chronologically? It's a very easy thing to do. If you're looking at a single author, it's like, do you split it up by start, middle, end of their writing career? If you're looking at a time period, let's say you're looking at a movement and how that movement did, do you look at like the early bit, the middle bit and the late bit? Do you look at, like for me with queer romance, it was like, okay, could I potentially look at it? Okay, so we've got like pre-2014, we've then got about 2014 to 2018, and then we've got 2018 onwards. So that's a way of structuring it. So you can always do things chronologically. There's also then thematic, which I think a lot of people prefer. So you group your research by themes. So for queer romance, obviously that's how I've done it in the end. I've done the queer body, found family, and queer relationships. Let's say you're doing Jane Austen, you could do Jane Austen's satire, Jane Austen's, I'm not a Jane Austen person, but you know what I mean, you could group it. If you're looking at the work of a single author, you could do a single chapter on one of their significant books, like 3 books, okay? So again, let's take Jane Austen. Chapter 1 is going to be all about Pride and Prejudice. Chapter 2 is going to be about Sense and Sensibility. Chapter 3 is going to be about Northanger Abbey. And let's say your PhD was on the economic viability of Jane Austen's romance heroes. I don't know, I'm not an Austen person. I feel like a lot's probably been done on her already. But that's just an example of how you could break it down. You could break it down by core text. You can break it down thematically. You could break it down chronologically. You could even break it down by methodology if you really wanted to. Let's say you are looking at the economics of Jane Austen's romance heroes. You could be like, okay, this is going to be my economic reading. This is going to be my social reading. This is going to be my something other reading. I don't know the methodologies, but you know what I'm trying to say. There are lots of different approaches you can take. And I think the best thing to do is have a play around with it. Look at the different structures. Look at how you feel when you have to start writing descriptions of what that chapter is going to be about. Is that something you ultimately want to spend 15,000-ish words on? Because if it isn't, maybe that's not the structure for you. I think the other thing that's important to mention is there is no right or wrong structure to a PhD thesis. Ultimately, you want to produce something that you are happy to write about. So have a play around with it. See what you think. See how you feel about the different methods. Feedback. So I think it's very important when putting together the structure for your PhD thesis is to remember you are not doing this alone. You are not the first person to do this, and getting feedback or just having a sounding board is super important. And by this, I don't just mean your supervisor team. Obviously, your supervisors are going to have, you know, an influence. You are going to discuss it with them. It would be kind of crazy if you didn't, but they are not the only people you can go to. I think it probably is worthwhile when you're thinking up all these structures to reach out to other PhD students, maybe go to a work in progress and just say to people like, so this is roughly what my project is. I'm thinking of structuring it like this. Even if they don't know a lot about your project, they might ask questions that you hadn't thought to ask. They might actually ask a question that makes you think, oh, I hadn't thought of it like that. Actually, that's a potential avenue of research that I had dismissed that could be super interesting, and that could be a chapter in itself. They might also, because they don't know about your research, point out something really obvious that you've just overlooked. When I was putting together my thesis, I asked a couple of PhD students who I didn't know super well, but I was just like, how did you go about structuring yours? This is kind of what I'm thinking, what do you think? And usually they're really happy to give feedback, and they've been through it. They know how they structured theirs, they can offer advice and things like that. And don't forget, the mid-year review in itself is feedback, and you will get feedback on your structure, you will get feedback on your chapter ideas. Usually it's very positive feedback, but potentially that's another source where someone could be like, oh, have you thought about this? Or have you feel maybe this is too big for a single chapter? Maybe you're trying to do too much, maybe you're trying to do too little. These are all questions you kind of need to ask yourself or have other people ask. And I think ultimately getting feedback on your structure throughout the PhD is super important. When I decided to get rid of my heteronormativity, homonormativity, I didn't just, wake up one day and be like, it's gone. I had a couple of discussions with friends. I had a couple of discussions with my supervisors. I kind of realized, oh, this is a recurring theme. How's that going to work for the chapter? It probably took a process of a couple of weeks for me to be very confident saying, yeah, I don't need that chapter anymore. It doesn't make sense. That's going to be a long running thread throughout the PhD. And I think that's something to remember as well. When you're thinking of these chapters, when you're thinking of the structure, what is the thing that's tying it all together? Ultimately, that should come back to your research questions, but that's a good way of thinking about it as well, because you don't want to end up with 3 completely separate chapters that don't really fit together and don't really make sense. Everything needs to be cohesive, everything needs to be building to an argument, and ultimately everything needs to be supporting your overall argument, your overall proposition, or whatever you're hoping to get out of the thesis. You want your conclusion to flow and logically pull all those chapters together, and it's a lot harder to do that if you've picked very disparate topics for your chapters. So ultimately that's about it. It's not that difficult, but it is something you need to spend a bit of time over and think over, and I would say don't stress about thinking about it straight away. As you start to research, things will come to light, different options will come to light, you will start to see different kind of avenues of research that maybe you hadn't considered when you started. And that's the great thing about when you start a PhD. The first 6 months you can kind of just research whatever you want, like let inspiration take you. If you read this really interesting article on something that isn't directly related to your research but opens up a new avenue, explore it, because that could become a really interesting part of your research, and it could be where you bring something new in that other people haven't considered before in your topic, in your field of interest. And I'd say those are the 3 main things that you need to think about. So the timeline, the structure, and obviously feedback from other people. As I said before, it's really important to feel confident in your structure. It's also important to remember how much words you have, how much time you have, how it's all going to flow together. And if you have any questions about how to structure a PhD thesis, or you don't want to ask them in the comments, always feel free to message me on Instagram. I will put it down below. There'll be a little link to my Instagram. And as always, like, subscribe, all that jazz. You know what you're doing by now. And I'll see you next Sunday. Bye.